Welcome, everybody. This is the panel on creating normal, on diversity of abilities. My name is Sean Bray. I run a record label called Accidental Guest Recordings. And I also run the website, Is This Venue Accessible, which documents if venues are accessible. I'm really honored to be a part of this today. And the papers here, the abstracts I've read are amazing. So immediately go here, all year. Just to call out
very end. So if you want to be stoked that these presentations are awesome, do a little hand wave, whatever. So with that all being said, I want to introduce the first presentation. His name is Kevin Gotkin, and the presentation is Crip, Glitch, Disability, and Mediation. Kevin is a PhD candidate at the Annenberg School of Communication, University of Pennsylvania. His research interests are in disability studies, histories of science, technology, and medicine, and critical media studies.
Thanks. Cool. Okay, so can you hear me? Can you hear me right now? Okay. Did I turn off the mic? I'll just talk really loud. All right. Okay. Okay. Let me just get set up. And while I get set up, if you need a large font copy of the text that I'm reading, I can pass those around. Kind of helps since we have like sensory distraction from the other panel who like them. Do you mind if I press that button? Okay, sorry, thanks. All right, so if you need any access requests while I'm talking, just let me know. If I can do anything now, just say it. Okay, cool. So I'm going to start with a video that has a soundtrack, but it's going to be muted, so I can talk over it. In her video project called If It Reads, It Bleeds, media artist and scholar Joanna Zielinska proposes that we can understand the blogosphere as a living thing. Colors in this video shift from light, fleshy tones to blood reds to coagulated darkness. Skin, blood, and scabs are what Zielinska is attempting to produce as she technically sutures together images of various blog posts into a two-dimensional yet dynamic collage that seems, in the end, eerily lifelike. The twinning of biology and technology is reinforced by the heartbeat in the soundtrack that drifts in and out of our focus but never quite disappears, reminding us that when we speak of technology, we often forget the embedded pulse of biology. At one point in the video, there are words covered over by other capillaries that read, "Have you ever looked down at your body and been surprised by what is there?" The out-of-bodiness registered in this banal blog post heading is meant to remind us of the becoming with of our media and our bodies, that for however much we want to insist on the skin-bound nature of human beings, apart from the cold, hard matter of our technology, we nonetheless glimpse the two together in moments when we see our bodies as objects, or conversely, we glimpse the vital subjectivity of all matter when we forget momentarily that our earphones are not naturally existing corporal devices. I start with this video because it makes a compelling case for thinking machines and bodies together. Zielinska makes this case more fully in her co-authored book with Sarah Kember called Life After New Media, where media are understood as technological artifacts like a camera or its photographs. Mediation, Kember and Zielinska say, is a more dynamic force that dips not only into the liveness of media, but also into a lifeness. This is a recent articulation in a long legacy of thinking that productively formulates machines and bodies as mirror image twins. Here I'm thinking of French philosopher Georges Canguilhem's 1947 lecture called Machine and Organism, in which he divines an Aristotelian origin of the biology-technology twinning, traces it through to Descartes and Kant, and ultimately proposes an important modification, which is to understand technology as already vital, always an extension of, and not simply a handy metaphorical analytic for understanding life itself. I am inspired in particular by Georges Canguilhem's 1943 dissertation on the normal and the pathological, which proposes that the study of the normal is made possible only by attempting to stabilize a corroborating contrary notion of the pathological. We could usefully understand this as a founding text in the contemporary academic field of disability studies, where theorists have illustrated the many ways that ideologies of ability are made possible only by subordinating disability as a seemingly natural inferior category. So when I say I'm interested in the many homologies of the human and the machine, I'm actually more interested in the many homologies of the disabled human and the disabled machine. And I'm working here towards a kind of Venn diagram where I center my attention on rupture and failure. So the chiasmic center of this homology I propose is the glitch. The word itself enters the English language in the mid-20th century as a technical term. In fact, the astronaut John Glenn is credited with proposing it in a 1962 text called Into Orbit, where he writes, sorry, my computer is being glitchy. It's like so easy to use when you're like presenting. So he says, a glitch is a spike or change in voltage in an electrical current. But following Canguilhem's method of discourse analysis, what seems here to be a specialized term in naming a spurious electrical disruption is in fact evidence that a certain technical vocabulary became possible by mid-20th century cybernetic thinking. Following media theorist Peter Krapp's insight about the role of noise in the rise of information theory around the time that glitch becomes an available word, we can see that the glitch is in fact a crucial component of how technical systems were explained to have their servo-mechanistic equilibrium. As Krapp notes, the search for the glitchless channel as a driving mid-century operative belies the radically generative ways that the glitch helps technicians and artists imagine novel and unpredictable forms. Krapp is one of a small group of glitch theorists who have started to make the compelling case that we should center our analyses of media not on what works, but on what fails, and what fails in beautiful ways. And I should just say that there is a robust artistic rendering in glitch art of this idea, and there's some art historical work that has started to take it up. The incipient field of what artist Rosa Menkman calls glitch studies has yet to take up, however, the vital heart of the glitch. So what I suggest, inspired by the work that I opened with, is that disabled machines implicate disabled bodies, and that if we reconfigure normative logics to embrace rather than eliminate these glitches, we might be lumbering toward a unified and emancipatory theory of disabled mediation. Media and medicine cooperate closely in fantasies of elimination of what is thought to be error, which means we need an analytic apparatus to reverse the project that we should see as an extension of eugenic world building. The glitch I propose is where disability lives in the digital, and the glitch signals disabled machines we can learn to love. So I propose that in the glitch we find the Crip. And Crip theory, as it's called in disability studies, is a radical anti-assimilationist project that names, similar to its queer sibling, a universalizing tendency towards disability. Disability is not simply the largest global minority, but also something all organisms become, a structure of feeling that challenges the ableist and eugenic attempts to fix, to either eliminate or hold steady as abject impairment. And here I'm showing a still from a wonderful video called Sick Bitch Crip Dance by Catherine Araniello, which illustrates much of this radical Crip potential. Glitch and Crip have deep kindred ties to each other, ties that signal liberationist potential for mediation's disabled futures. So in the few minutes that I have remaining, I'm just going to offer up a reading of one of the objects I think I'm going to use for this project, and then I'll just close with some more reflection. Okay, so there's a kind of like broken jazz soundtrack that you might or may not be able to hear. It's gonna get muted in a second. Okay, so in the opening to this 2005 video by Takeshi Murata called Monster Movie, there is a mostly black background spotted with pixelated chunks of pied visuals, like when something is taking long to load or buffer online. The blackness turns out to be a dark body of water, out of which emerges what looks like the eponymous monster. A head covered in a wet mass of tangled hair slowly rises out of the water and then suddenly explodes into obscurity. The video then repeats the movement data of the monster's head rising out of the water, but the image data are new each time, a variegated disarray of colors and forms overlaid onto the movement of the head. Then a perfectly lucid image frame interrupts the previous scene. There it is. The monster, really a caveman, to use the 1981 title of the movie Murata is sampling from, walks toward the camera in what looks like an icy cave. As with the first sequence, the movement then repeats with a garbled visual mess over it. The same pattern repeats throughout the video. Each time a clip of the monster is shown and then glitched by a confused palette of colors and forms. Murata's glitch art practice is called data moshing. He is toying with the two kinds of image frames that are used to transmit streaming video content online, one of which carries information about movement and the other about the image itself. Data moshing intentionally confuses the movement and image data, creating, in this case, a pattern while thwarting any attempt at its neat completion. Murata carefully maneuvers around a common hazard in glitch art practices that as soon as you've successfully produced a glitch, you've also lost it. If the glitch cannot, by its very definition, be controlled or produced, which we could perhaps call a glitch effect, but not a glitch itself. Murata instead distributes the agency of the glitch by creating a movement image hybrid, such that the two kinds of data modify each other simultaneously. Most interesting about this video is that it questions what we believe to be underneath the glitch. There is a conspicuous essentialism that comes into play when we talk about the glitch, as if it sits on the surface but doesn't modify some representational core of what lies below. In the first rounds of the distortion after the monster sequence is played, you almost get the sense that you can still see the monster moving. But after a few more rounds of moshing, it's hard to decipher the original monster body. It's hard to say in the end whether the glitch is something that might be redeemed or corrected, or whether the glitch fundamentally alters the image we behold. We think the monster is in the water, but the monster might be the glitch itself. I use Murata's Monster Movie here because it sets the stage so well for the analytic depth I want to propose for Crip glitch media, which I want to put at the fore of how we understand digital disability. Murata's glitch teased, if that's an apt descriptor, seems to suggest at first that the glitch is a temporary disability, that it can be restored. But the Crip potential at the heart of Murata's video is that the glitch only seems recuperable if it's a normative logic of function and maintenance that we're after. The data-moshed monster instead suggests that to truly accommodate and appreciate the glitch, we have to reconsider our instincts to find and maintain what appears as normal. Thus, the analytic value of the glitch is two-pronged. The glitch represents an unexpected eruption of form, often seemingly temporary on the surface, something which might be quickly fixed. But the desire to return to a normal state of affairs represents a troubling commitment to logics of elimination that we can see in the ways media and medicine cooperate in projects of eugenic world building. Thus, we must understand the glitch as an intrinsically irredeemable error, one that forces a catharsis of forms and that paves the way to newly configured systems. So I'll end here, but as I hope has become clear, the analytic value of the glitch is as true in its mediated forms as it is for its human incarnations. So in other words, I hope these dimensions of glitch and Crip cannot allow for us to think of bodies and media as neatly separated. And I'll just end there. Thank you for signing Kapp. You use ASL, it's great.
That was awesome. Next, we have Kristen Gillespie-Lynch. Her paper is Autism and the Internet. Kristen is an assistant professor of psychology using a combination of both behavioral observations, eye tracking, online surveys, and standardized measures. She studies strengths and weaknesses associated with autism spectrum disorders across the lifespan.
Can you guys hear me? No, not really. Yes? Okay, so I'm going to talk really fast, because this is one of my focused interests, so I have a lot to convey. If you can't hear me, raise your hand in the back. So this is about autism and the internet, and this is a common way people think about autism and the internet, as difficult to get people to disengage from the internet. And my two co-authors, Kapp and Christina Shane-Simpson, can't be here today. So autism, even though recently in the DSM-5 has been conceptualized as one autism spectrum disorder, many people still think of it as autisms. So multiple different ways of being with multiple different causes. And you can see here art by two famous autistic artists. And you can see that even though they're both famous autistic artists, which many autistic people aren't, their art is very different. So they're viewing the world, one is viewing the world in a very detail-oriented way, and the other one is viewing the world in a very gestural way. And this speaks to the idea that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. There's a famous quote by an autistic self-advocate and professor, Stephen Shore. And this is the current DSM-5 criteria for autism spectrum disorder. You can see there's two broad domains, social communication disorder and restricted interest in repetitive behaviors. And when people think about autism, they often think about just the former, and they often don't think about the restricted interest in repetitive behaviors. And what I'm going to be arguing in this talk is that the restricted interest in repetitive behaviors have a lot to do with how autism relates to the internet. And also notice the last of the restricted interest, sensory issues. That's a new inclusion to the diagnostic criteria that autistic self-advocates played a really big role in getting included. So we all have some autistic traits. And in fact, gifted people and systematic thinkers tend to have more autistic traits than other people. Autism is just diagnosed when those traits limit functioning. And so this is how autism is often represented online and sometimes in person, as a tragedy where people are kidnapped, as something that's caused by vaccines, which leads people to not get vaccines for their children. This is a controversial ad that came from NYU, a kidnapping ad that caused a lot of anger in the autistic self-advocate community, where autism was viewed as something that had kidnapped someone's children. Autism is viewed as an epidemic that's terrifying and should be stopped. And this was a recent statement by one of the co-founders of the Autism Speaks, which is one of the largest autism organizations in the United States, where she described what it's like to have a child on the spectrum. And this also led to a lot of controversy and led to the last self-advocate who had been aligned with Autism Speaks removing himself from this alignment, because this described autism as a terrible tragedy that ruined life, basically. And this all speaks to this idea of autism as a pain, something that people are trapped behind, that if you could remove, you would see the real child. So there's a common discourse about autism that you'll find online. But obviously that's not the only discourse. There's also the voice of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, which is a neurodiversity-aligned viewpoint that autism is an important part of human diversity that should be accepted instead of trying to cure it or remove it. And these people fight instead for the rights of autistic people and appropriate supports for them. There's also Wrong Planet, which is a place where a lot of these viewpoints arose. Autism and neurodiversity are discussed on Twitter, on Facebook. This is a really valuable resource about knowledge about autism that challenges many different ways of thinking about autism that are more medical-oriented. And on YouTube, there are autistics who come out to describe their experiences and to challenge conventional ways of thinking about autism. So the internet has been used to pathologize autism and to think about it in fundamentally different ways as an important aspect of human diversity. And in fact, a long time ago, in 1997, people started to view the internet as a place that was uniquely suited to support the emergence of ideas of neurodiversity. And so in this article, Harvey Bloom pointed out that even though autism is supposedly defined by social communicative difficulties, on the internet, autistic people were communicating very capably. And he quoted an autistic person who described the internet as a liberating force. And he said that the impact of the internet would be similar to the spread of sign language among the deaf. So the internet was allowing people to communicate who had not previously been able to communicate effectively. And in fact, the democratization of the information flow on the internet has been viewed as a very important aspect of the neurodiversity movement by Singer, who was the autistic self-advocate who initially coined the term neurodiversity. And this idea of neurodiversity has received a lot of media attention, some of it positive and some of it negative. Some common misconceptions about neurodiversity are that people don't want supports for lower functioning people on the spectrum. And this is based on an idea that there are higher and lower functioning people on the spectrum, which the neurodiversity movement completely rejects. People are different in different contexts. This is a Second Life autistic self-advocacy group that's trying to educate about autism and neurodiversity. And a researcher studying this group pointed out that there was a lot of valuable information in the group, but there weren't very many people there to view it. And this is one of the issues that can happen with this autistic way of challenging medical model online, is that sometimes these challenges might not reach people because of the social difficulties that people face offline may be recapitulated online, which is something that I'm going to talk about in a moment. And this is a researcher who claims that the internet is a site where autistic people can create new cultures that are based on more effective ways of communication that they can choose more. And so all of this discourse has led to the idea that the internet may be uniquely autism compatible. And it might be providing people with contact with similar others, which may allow them to think about different ways of being, to learn about neurodiversity, and to interact in fundamentally different ways. Or it may allow them more comprehension and control over communication. And the internet is also potentially beneficial for autistic people for non-social reasons, because it may help them explore their focused interests. But how the computer-mediated communication is beneficial for autistic people hasn't been well examined. People have thought that computer-based information is organized by predictable rules, which may be really well aligned to the systematic processing style of autistic people. And also, computers can be accessed from familiar locations. So if you're anxious, you can access it from your home. You don't have to go out into an environment that might be very challenging. And they can be individualized in terms of things like pace and communication channels, so the type of communication channel and the number of communication channels. So when Harvey Bloom first stated that the internet was a unique way that autistic people could access the world and challenge conceptions of autism, he also compared it to Braille. So again, this idea of a different way of communicating where people could suddenly be heard. And he pointed out that previous to the internet becoming something that was widely used, autistic people were spoken for. And with the internet, they learned ways to speak for themselves. And he was very influenced by Temple Grandin. How many people have heard of Temple Grandin? So she's a very famous autistic self-advocate, and he quoted her in his article. And this is a paper she wrote later where she described the things that he talked about in the article. So she described how her mind is like an internet search engine. And when she thinks of orange, she sees many different things that are orange. She also points out in this article that there's many different ways of seeing the world if you're autistic. Because early on when she'd first started talking about autism, she just talked about one way. And then she'd gotten feedback from lots of autistic people who said they saw the world differently. So a key idea that may underlie this alignment between autism and the internet is monotropism, or attention tunneling, where the internet allows people to tunnel into their interests. And despite all of these different theories about why the internet may be beneficial, no one had previously asked autistic people if it was uniquely beneficial for them. So we conducted a study where we compared autistic people and non-autistic people to see how they perceived the internet. And one of the first things we found, which we expected to find based on Harvey Bloom's work, was that autistic people were more aware of neurodiversity and also more likely to learn about it online than other people. And they were also more likely to say that the internet is uniquely beneficial for them. So they were less likely to say it does not help them, and more likely to say it allows them to express their true self, to practice interaction, to have time to think, to choose who to talk to find people like you. And they also found the textual aspects of the internet beneficial. And one thing you'll see here is they didn't find it beneficial to hide who they were online. So they were using the internet to express themselves more fully. Even though there's these benefits of the internet that the autistic people reported relative to other people, there's also potential costs. So one potential cost is what I mentioned in terms of Second Life, where the lack of social connections offline may be recapitulated online. Another cost is that it may help people initiate interaction, but then they have a really hard time deepening those interactions and maintaining them. Some people like that there's not many social cues online, and some people don't like that, and they find it makes it really hard to understand what's happening online. And then a lot of autistic people have talked about the permanence of CMC, so a lot of the topics we've talked about here. And autistic people may also be drawn to non-social uses of the internet. So they may actually be using the internet and doing less social interaction, which parents of autistic people have been very concerned about. And also there's been an argument, which was depicted in my first slide, that the internet may be a way that autistic people become something autistic people become addicted to. So they may be prone to compulsive internet use. And this viewpoint is based on a study in the general population where they found associations between autistic traits and compulsive internet use, but there have been no comparisons of autistic and non-autistic people to see if that's actually the case. And so in speaking to this idea that offline difficulties may be apparent online, we found in our study that autistic participants were being drawn to certain types of communication. So they were drawn to very interest-based types of communication. They enjoyed using forums and blogs, sharing their expertise, and meeting people online more than non-autistic people, while they liked sites where you maintain connections less. So they liked social network sites less, and just maintaining connections in general less. They liked the telephone, face-to-face interaction, texting, and Skype less than non-autistic people. But we found that these were not categorical. They were dimensional. So if you looked at autistic traits, regardless of whether people were autistic or not, you found that these differences were also apparent among people with heightened autistic traits who weren't autistic. So people with heightened autistic traits found the processing time beneficial, and they didn't enjoy social network sites as much as other people and were more drawn to forums and blogs. So when you think about autism as something dimensional, where we're all on a dimension with degrees of autism, then you can come up with new ways of questioning whether autistic people are likely to actually be prone to compulsive internet use. And so these studies that have previously shown that autism is associated with compulsive internet use, there's now 3 of them. So people are like, because they struggle with these social difficulties, they're getting drawn to the computer, which is making their social difficulties worse. And there's this viewpoint of the internet as something very dangerous for autistic people based on this research. But this research hasn't examined if these associations are due to social difficulties or restricted interest in repetitive behaviors. And it also hasn't examined if autistic people actually have compulsive internet use problems. So we did a study with college students where we found these associations again between autism symptoms and compulsive internet use, but we found they were specific to restricted interest in repetitive behaviors. So if you controlled for those, it was not related to social symptoms. So it doesn't seem like people are being drawn to the internet to overcome their social difficulties, but they're being drawn to it to explore their interests, which speaks back to that idea of monotropism. And we also compared a small sample of autistic college students to students who were not autistic. We recruited them from a mentorship program we have. And there was no evidence that they had compulsive internet use. And so these findings speak back to a study conducted at the very beginning of when people started to be concerned about compulsive internet use by Shodan, who interviewed people who were showing internet dependency, and she found that they preferred the safe and predictable world of the inanimate to the confusing world of people. So she found people that were interested in exploring their focused interests online. But she didn't view this necessarily as a problem. She said the internet allowed them to make sense of their worlds, to investigate things they cared deeply about, and often to turn hobbies into careers. So she pointed to the fact that the internet allows attention tunneling and said this could actually be a benefit. And so overall, our work shows that the internet is uniquely beneficial for autistic people, but this is a comparison of autistic people and just people in general. It's likely these issues are not specific to autism. So anxious people also prefer computer-mediated communication to in-person communication. Shy people often feel that they can express themselves better online. People who lack social support in general like to meet people online. So these are general characteristics. There may be more of a close match between pursuing your interests online and autistic traits, but these are likely to be dimensional, so something that we all share rather than something that's just specific to autism. And also it's important to point out that the internet is not attractive to all autistic people. So in our mentorship program, we have a number of autistic students who can barely send an email and are not interested in the internet. They'd rather go fishing. They say the internet is like a place where things are confusing, where interactions are not rich. So there's a huge variability in how autistic people are interacting with the internet. So the internet likely provides a space for alternative ways of being to develop for some, and then for other autistic people, it's likely a poor substitute for offline interactions. And thank you to David Shane-Smith, who's helped with this, and my other collaborators.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Next, we have Annie Pasek. She is presenting a paper on Techno-Autism, Confronting the Ableist Ideals in Media Criticism. doctoral student of media history. Her research centers on the philosophy and contingencies of technology with a focus on the aesthetics, fragility, and performative stakes of digital infrastructures. She holds a Master's of Arts degree in Art History from the McGill University and a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Art History from the University of Alberta.
Thank you. How's the sound?
Probably close.
Sound? All right. Thumbs up from the back. Thank you so much. If it fails, if that stuff is a problem, please put up your hand. Also, if you need to adjust, move around, feel free to. I think creating Crip spaces is important. Why not do it here? So, you're probably familiar with expressions of panic and alarm around what social media is reportedly doing to the nature of human social experience. That there is a transformative effect at play that serves to weaken or impoverish the quality of human sociality compared to the richness of face-to-face communication. Such concerns are common fodder of news reports and PTA meetings, wherein Facebook, texting, or any number of digitally mediated communications are put on show trial. At stake in such debates is much more than just the tenor of the exchange or the cultural status of a given media form. Pervasively underscoring the rhetoric of this discussion is the specter of disability, the unmaking of seemingly innate capacities, and the presumed loss of something that makes us intimately human. Most notably, these losses are often articulated in ways that align with autism spectrum disorder. Jokingly or not, people claim that the internet is making us autistic. And autism is a ripe candidate for this kind of analogy. Its biological basis is poorly understood, such that its diagnosis is conducted largely through behavioral speculation. Though autism has more recently been conceived as a spectrum onto which every individual is to some degree located, autism as a clinical disability has more specifically been correlated with evidence of globally or locally diminished cognitive capacities, poor social integration, and an impaired ability in navigating reciprocal or emotive forms of communication. Like the isolated technological internet overuser, autistic people are widely presumed to live in affective remoteness, defensively withdrawn from the vibrancy and vulnerability of intersubjective contact. Significantly, new media technologies in autism have grown together historically, emerging in force in the 1990s. Concurrent with the rise of the internet was the beginning of autism's so-called epidemic, whereby rates of autism's prevalence shot up dramatically, with estimates ranging from 2 to 5 individuals per 10,000 in the year 1980 to that of 120 individuals per 10,000 by 1999. This rise was later explained through a multitude of independent factors, including limitations in the statistical analysis of some of the more extreme figures, higher rates of diagnosis, but not necessarily incidence, in the DSM-3 and 4, and the greater presence of cognitive difference within the public sphere following from the dismantling of many custodial institutions. At the height of the perceived epidemic, however, there was a concerted attempt to locate the cause of autism through the epidemiological models, searching for some manner of pervasive environmental cause. Whether through the hidden perils of vaccines, pesticides, or even television use, autism has frequently been figured as sort of the dire consequence of the unprecedented rise of estranging technologies in the West. Electronic and digital media, as newcomers to the social landscape now in question, were quickly associated with that condition. Either as a prognosis or merely a convenient shorthand for the declining quality of communication engendered by media, autism has been a site of rhetorical address, where anxieties and fears about technology congeal. Even in media studies, with its comparatively greater depth and reflexivity than the news, we'd like to hope, has not been immune. Emerging in early feminist appraisals of virtual reality, media art criticism, and contemporary affect studies alike, autism looms as a metaphor for that which is isolating and dehumanizing about technology. Here is just a brief sample. Anne Balsamo's 1996 book, Technologies of the Gendered Body, contains the following provocative statement. Quote, "Even as VR technology promises a new form of intersubjectivity, it contributes to a heretofore unknown epidemic of cultural autism." End quote. What precisely cultural autism is intended to mean is unclear in the text, but the implications are clearly negative, serving as a dystopian symbol for the socially damaging effects of technological sociality. Media art theorists also join the fray, using autism as a means to disparage technologically intensive directions and interests in the field. Hurt Lovnick's 2008 caustic reading of new media art, for example, draws on autism by the way of its presumed insularity. In criticizing a lack of spontaneous and outwardly communicatively curious projects, he notes, quote, "This is where new media art becomes autistic. Artistic research needs not end in self-contained objects," end quote. Staying autistically engaged into the technology itself, he implies, dooms media art to irrelevance and aesthetic depreciation. Even as scholarly concerns shift from virtual to augmented reality, technology's bodily and social effects continue to be articulated through the language of disability. Sherry Turkle's 2011 book, Alone Together, Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other, explicitly and derogatively references autism in its discussion of care work robotics. Warning against the kind of damage technologically mediated intimacy could bring, she notes in her conclusion, "Human beings are capable of infinite combinations of vocal inflection and facial expression. It is from other people that we learn how to listen and bend to each other in conversation. Our eyes light up with interest and darken with passion or anxiety. We recognize, and are most comfortable with, other people who exhibit this fluidity. We recognize and are less comfortable with people with autism or Asperger's syndrome who do not exhibit it. The developmental implications of children taking robots as models are unknown, potentially disastrous. Humans need to be surrounded by human touch, faces, and voices. Humans need to be brought up by humans." To this, one is tempted to ask, are autistic people not also human and deserving of parenthood? What are the ableist implications of comparing autistic people to robots? Turkle's remarks, while describing a possible future of increasingly mediated digital and robotic communications, are intended to mobilize greater scrutiny towards the embodied and psychological effects of contemporary forms of technological sociality. In the process, however, she reaffirms a rigidly neurotypical ideal for what bodily communication is meant to constitute, and what the inherent capacities of users of technology are or should be. The ideal, witnessed across this short list of scholars, enacts a very troubling exclusion of differently abled subjects and concomitant communicative possibilities and experiences. Now, as a historian, however, I would argue that the priority on face-to-face, affectively laden communication is neither particularly new nor uniquely threatened in the contemporary moment. Plato's Phaedrus, for example, which consists of dialogues between Socrates and a young pupil on the subjects of love and the written word, concludes that only oral communication produces reciprocal presence and care of address such that perversions of logic can be prevented. Parallel tensions can be found going back as far as the 1880s with the rise of new forms of disembodied technologies such as the photograph and telegram. As described by John Durham Peters, these early forms of virtuality, divorced of the full range of embodied social nuance and capacities, were interpreted through the twinned anxieties of solipsism and telepathy, for fear that these modern communications would either fail to provide meaningful social contact or wholly overwhelm the subjectivities of its participants through invasive, deterministic suggestion. This perceived or over-abling of media subjects has led to well over a century of academic, popular, and cultural debate on the meaning of communication in the wake of these forms of bodily interruption. Seen in this light, the contemporary techno-autistic scare appears merely as one instance of a perennial frustration with technological change and communicative affordances. However, the centrality of autism in contemporary remarks helps reveal the extent to which the ideal of human communication, defended in critiques of new media, is, and always has been, ableist. Communication enjoys a certain pride of place in the way in which we define the human. Eye contact, a sympathetic smile, or a touch on the shoulder might appear as vividly human moments of exchange, particularly in contrast to the limited capacities of mediated text. Calling these qualities human and decrying the screen, the page, or the sign as deformations thereof serves to dehumanize those for whom communication is a rather more complicated affair. Autism, in its metaphorical invocations, is more often trafficked for its negative stereotypes and cultural anxieties rather than any serious consideration of the phenomenological or relational similarities between the condition and the technology in question. This discursive laxity with a legitimate social identity and medical condition not only feeds harmful cultural anxieties around autism and the state of contemporary relationality, it does not allow for the object of the analogy to speak back to the writers and texts that mobilize it so roughly. I would like to argue that this is simultaneously an ethical and scholarly problem, for these gestures risk enacting forms of representational violence and also omit what stands to be a rich field of knowledge about human relational diversity. To begin with, in mobilizing disabilities as negative models for technological sociality, scholars and journalists problematically presume the static and inherent nature of autistic social impairments themselves. Disability studies scholars, conversely, have strongly contested the way in which sociality can be approached as a property of discrete individuals, rather than the ways in which sociality becomes an emergent outcome in a broader cultural sphere. While autism is commonly described in terms of isolation or entrapment in the prison of the disabled mind, activists have long argued that social disabilities, such as autism, largely derive from the narrow models of successful sociality themselves. When face-to-face communication and affectively laden speech are no longer considered as the sole or privileged models of communication, studies show that autistic people enjoy vastly improved forms of social coordination, particularly when employing mediated communicative tools such as a tablet, a notebook, or a companion animal. These advocacy efforts, focusing on accommodating difference rather than correcting deviation from the social and neurotypical ideal, have contributed to a political reach of autistic voices within the larger neurodiversity movement, arguing for the recognition of different models of thinking and embodiment as natural and valued parts of human variation. For autistic individuals, indirect communication and unusual bodily gestures may be the best way to engage in interpersonal exchange and self-expression. The privileging of nuanced forms of verbal and corporeal interactions as the only or ideal means of sociality is the principal means by which autistic communication impairments become disabilities. Technological change and critiques of ableism create the impetus to broaden the definition of human communication and meaningful relationality therein. The process of expanding this boundary, however, is not an easy one, insofar as it displaces long-held ideals and creates new challenges for relational translation. In the case of autism, real relational limitations impede the legibility and participation of many individuals within a normative framework for human communication. Unlike other forms of physical impairments, these difficulties cannot be resolved through simply building wheelchair ramps or programming better computer interfaces. To the contrary, the challenge posed by these relational impairments require a far greater commitment, the need to both recognize and learn from different forms of communication and bodily understanding. Accordingly, the next time someone claims that the internet is making us autistic, whether jokingly over beers or in a peer-reviewed paper, I hope that you'll pause, not only to ask them what they mean by that, but also to question whether or not that's an inherently bad thing. Thank you.
All right, Anne, thank you very much. And finally, we have Kenneth Rogers, who's presenting a paper, Split Screens and Divided Attention, Mobile Internet Technology and Transactional Disability. Ken is an assistant professor in the Department of Cinema and Media Arts at York University. His interdisciplinary research and publication is concerned with the intersection of labor, attention, political economy, digital media, and cultural practice. He is the author of The Attention Complex Media Archaeology Method.
Where's the play? Okay. Is that, can you hear me in the back, everybody? Is that, okay. I want to begin with actually a verse from a track by Kendrick Lamar made in 2011. So I'm just going to start with that and just show it. Let's do a quick verse from that. Okay, it's not working. Maybe I'll hold it up to the microphone. Maybe that's a better way. Let's see if that works. Is that okay? track titled ADHD, found on his 2011 Top Dog release, Section 80, Kendrick Lamar takes a behavioral diagnosis predominantly leveling the playing field for privileged white male youths during the very era that repealed affirmative action, and reclaims it as a social symptom of a generational alienation felt by Section 80, which refers to, with clever alliteration, Section 8 housing, an experience of marginality felt by black youths born in the 1980s under the sign of crack and Ronald Reagan. Failed promises of self-reliant prosperity and coming of age during a time of intensifying economic vulnerability, this emerging affective exclusion cannot be remedied away by the hollow pronouncement of entry into a post-black era, Lamar protests. Her president is black, she black too, purple label on her back, but that tab is light blue. Coming of age during the Great Recession as children left behind in the social and technological race to the top, this generation takes no solace in racialized forms of political representation and are left searching for quick and immediate remedies and pleasures that can be lived between the debilitating stresses of survival found in the Adderall tablet's signature light blue pill. This is a burden disproportionately carried by people of color in a land of diminishing opportunity, by a group for whom blackness is not a fixed political identity, but a changing set of difficulties and a commonly lived set of social conditions. The tactical response is to reclaim a diagnosis of disability designed to accommodate others. Lamar finds the pressure point where a cultural diagnosis can be turned against itself, or better, turned inside out like a garment and then worn with the gratification of collective ownership. Not theirs, but our diagnosis. Section 80, ADHD crazy, crack babies. Got a high tolerance when your age don't exist. This shrug of reclamation, reclaimed by a non-existent age, is a case of a larger cultural phenomenon of transaction in the contest of the power over attention. Now, my earlier research has been a deep archaeology of the concept of attention in order to map the interconnections among the human sciences, human technologies, and forms of human sociology into a diagram of something I call the attention complex. This began in the late 1950s when attention was taken up by cognitive theory and cybernetics to operationalize its capacity for the deep techno-political investment in the post-war information societies, and then was later extended in the 1980s when the cognitive theories of attention were overwritten by neurobiological determinism, diagnostic clinical psychology, and forms of biotechnical self-regulation and self-management. But currently, I want to take up some of the lingering questions not addressed in the book to diagnose what attention is currently in the process of becoming. What I see on the horizon, then, is our discourses, practice, and sciences and technologies of human attention is a new a reality of transaction along the axis of ability and disability, or what I would call transactional disability, a term which I will start to sketch in some limited way here today. For this, I want to elaborate on a term Foucault calls transactional reality, which, like madness, sexuality, and civil society, shapes a transferential site where external technologies of power encounter the self. Transactional realities are figures formed within a zone of exigency that is the rapid deployment of a containment strategy of forces that are found to be in excess of power relations. In the case of the problem of attention, it cuts across all the diverse spheres of influence that seek to govern it from above or below through different means, some concentrated and localized, others diffuse and ubiquitous, that cannot be responded to in any one sphere of influence alone. For example, when attention is pathologized as a disorder contributing to the behavioral problem of a child, it can be met at multiple sites of society and acted upon through a diversity of means. The child's attention might be monitored by the family, contained by the public schools, explained by cognitive science, diagnosed as a pathology by clinical psychology, intervened upon by pharmaceutical medicine, legislated and enforced through disability rights, directed by media technology, and even aggregated and valued as a kind of capital or labor. The cumulative effects of these transactions between the individual and these multiple spheres of influence make attention a reality that can then be felt, experienced, measured, discussed, etc. It makes it kind of I would say almost a switch point between these different zones. So I now want to detail, in turn it becomes a real part of the history of experience, but a reality not one of substances, but rather of effects. So I now want to detail a few very recent transactional effects of the attention complex that seem to orbit around the axis of ability and disability. So I'll begin with disabling Wi-Fi. In the most recent season of Broad City, Abby and Alana gabbing face to face on Alana's couch, simultaneously pull out their wireless devices to clarify an anecdote about Judge Judy's net worth. They rapidly withdraw from each other into a multi-screen netherworld. Their conviviality is silenced as they tap furiously through a flutter of BuzzFeed, delisted TMZ celebrity gossip pages, cruise their Grindr, Tinder, Instagram, Snapchat profiles. I love that they're on Grindr. Take personality tests and cuddle up to LOL cats, reaction GIFs, or GIFs, if you were in the last panel, that debate raged. The mood turns dark, and their jaws become slack. Their eyes glaze in ghastly illumination of screen light as they sit silent in parallel play. Day turns to night, night to dawn, and they reunite in a split-screen video chat, only to be startled and dismayed by their loss of awareness that they had been together all the while. Broad City is an exemplary of what I might call millennial malaise comedies, which tend to represent a generation in arrested development, constantly cycling through emotional extremes, a sense of betrayal at the world of false promises and diminishing opportunities, unearned confidence and entitlement following a string of esteem-crushing humiliations, excessive optimism and euphoria undermined by infantilizing diversions, relentlessly distracting them from the crucible of adulthood. This all kind of resonates with something Trevor Scholes was talking about yesterday about fatigue society and optimism being the more problematic term rather than a kind of depression or objection. So in this show, or many of these shows, compulsively divided attention consistently thwarts their drive toward autonomy. This is particularly true in the female-driven comedies like Broad City and Girls, where unlike the homosocially bonded man-children of the bromance, Abby and Alana have a pledge to immediately share their entire life experiences at the very moment of its unfolding. Even when not physically present, they remain umbilically enmeshed by mobile media technology that binds them to each other, but consistently sabotages their anxious pursuit of secure employment, emotional stability, and lasting romantic relationships. They check in, text, call, tweet, chat, as they flit from job to job, party to party, or even mid-sexual encounter, as we can see here with Abby FaceTiming Alana while she's, Alana's while she's in bed with Lincoln, played by Hannibal Buress, and of course the famous Shinjo episode from this latest season, where they were constantly texting as she has a sexual encounter. Where was I? More than once in the series, Alana apologizes to a temporary employer for taking a call from Abby in the middle of a job interview to alert Abby that she was, in fact, in the middle of a job interview. "I'm so sorry, I had to take that, I really did," Alana says, overselling her professionalism. You made that call in the middle of our conversation," the employer scolds. "Did I?" she responds, as if more to convince herself. These lapses of attention, if not as extreme as, say, Fred Armisen's multitasking brain fail in Portlandia, depict the perpetually mediated and often self-medicated distraction as a generational disability, which is both the cause and effect of an endless cycle of adaptation to a world that always rushes forward but never progresses. And I think Girls is slightly different here, and I have lots to say about all of this, like Key and Peele and Portlandia, I think, are versions of this, but I'll stop there because clearly I watch a lot of television, so I'll just... okay, on to the next. On the surface, the DSM-5, the so-called diagnostic Bible of the APA, represents a cynical expansion into unexploited markets like adult ADHD to culturally legitimize the use of off-prescription psychostimulants for performance enhancements. But a more nuanced reading is that the DSM-5 contains a shift in tone that suggests the treatment of attention disorders are not only about correcting, fixing, and conforming brains to an operational norm, but as a means of augmenting and diversifying the psychopharmacological techniques of self-control, the norm of which is neither known or constant, but conditional. In the emerging era of clinical neuroscience, the normal and the pathological have begun to kind of echo the Kangahelmian language mentioned before. The normal and pathological have become variable terms within X number of environments, And this has enabled attention to link up with a larger cultural anxiety of the situationally disabled self, exemplified in, for example, Broad City or Girls, or particularly Girls in Hannah's eruption of OCD when it derails her writing aspirations, or the pills hoarded by desperate housewife Lynette Scavo, whose son's ADHD medication becomes the primary remedy to her entrapment with the cultural expectations of middle-class stay-at-home motherhood. This move beyond diagnostic normalization is not exclusive to attention, but is similar in the transactional disability found in the autism explosion, for example, the diagnostic criteria for which have now become an array of symptoms and behaviors one can place on a spectrum, to not only expand the categories, but also more flexibly consider the context that determines functional impairment. The DSM-5 has rewritten the tone of the diagnostic Bible, once addressed to the expert clinician in a kind of specialized language, in a common tongue, a polyvocal biblios of shifting voices and modes of address, which indicate that the diagnostic function of the psi complex is now outsourced, becoming distributed throughout the social body. So I want to conclude just by talking about an example of how I think this distribution of diagnostic function is starting to occur. In my experience, we just got through a very kind of heated long-term strike at York University that suspended courses and all kinds of these things. And I noticed that in the remediation process, which we're still in, I got a flood of disability request accommodations that were beyond the usual amount that I got. So I can say more about that, but I'm going to try to draw some links here in conclusion. Without dismissing the very important history of rights activism and advocacy that has won important disability equity in the university, what I think is going on here is that attention disorders have linked up with disability rights to become a means of responding to a crisis facing what we often describe in a familiar list of grievances against the neoliberal university: downsizing, outsourcing labor, MOOCs and distance learning, activity-based budgeting, non-academic governance, the for-profit, consumer-driven, fee-for-service model of higher education, and of course, its mirror image in society as a whole: stagnant wages, the decline of unions, offshoring, job market volatility, etc. In this syndrome, attention disability has become a transactional means to navigate a complex system of an educational world in flux. And I'm not flatly accusing students of gaming the system of disability accommodations any more than I would scold someone for taking off-prescription ADHD drugs to enhance cognitive performance, or for any other reason for that matter. What I'm interested in is how this expansion of administrative and institutional protocols around disability cannot be exclusively codified as the protection of civil rights, legitimized by the DSM and the APA, but extends into a much larger set of situational circumstances that at any moment potentially affect us all, while also acknowledging that some groups of people are far more at risk than others, or at risk in different ways. In this sense, what I'm calling transactional disability is aligned with what Jasper-Puar calls debility, a term that rejects liberal humanist notions of disability by bringing in affect theory into disability studies so that it does not so rigidly fix the able-disabled subject positions, but can more fluidly describe people living in a global system of disablement wrought by disaster capitalism. But no one states this with more brevity and lyricism than Kendrick Lamar when he says, "You know why we crack babies? Because we born in the 80s, that ADHD crazy."
All right, thank you very much. And I want to introduce our Hashmod, Sarah Galo. Are you? Hello. Can we pass it? Do we have any kind of things you would like to add that you've seen online? Can we pass this mic to her?
There was one question. There was just one question after Kristen's presentation about the implications of computer mediated communications and fully online college courses for people who are on the spectrum. I think that was from a professor who's watching on the live stream. But otherwise, it's been mostly just highlighting quotes that everyone said. It's been really great.
So the question is whether that would be beneficial for us?
Yeah, it's just about the implications of how that would work for fully online.
So, well, there's been a lot of research that suggests that fully online programs aren't completely effective. lot of them, I think, would, a lot of the same issues that arise for the general population would arise, and the lack of in-person feedback, the lack of opportunities to engage with others. So it could be desirable for some, but not all.
Okay, I wanted to open up to the floor if anybody has any questions. Raise your hand, we can. So we'll start with you.
So first, thanks for all those really amazing papers. They were really great. They really spoke to each other in a lot of ways. And I basically have a question that could be for anybody. And this is something that I struggle a lot with when it comes to disability rights. And I really enjoyed Anne's paper where you talked about how autism, is the category through which all sorts of anxieties about technology are refracted through, right? And that's extremely, extremely problematic. And it really has to be hammered, that message has to be hammered more vividly. But, bringing up transactional capitalism, there is also a strain in environmentalism that is really kind of focusing in on the chemicals that poison our bodies, right? And these chemicals are extremely problematic. It's a very different form of media, and there's all sorts of players who do everything possible to kind of stall research in that realm. And there's a lot of unknowns about the effects of these chemicals, but it's often not good. It can often have cognitive effects as well. So how does one, on the one hand, make sure that autism is not pathologized for kind of other brain disorders, but then also possibly, potentially fight the poisoning of humans through chemicals that is occurring at kind of a large mass industrial scale? So that's the question.
Fantastic question. I think a really important one, a big one. The sort of answer that comes most readily to mind is just sort of borrowed out of the philosophy of ethics, is sort of the capacities approach, where when you're doing, as philosophers do, that sort of highly logical calculus of how we best define the good life, you try to emphasize capacity. And I think that involves an interesting sort of play with temporality, where you're looking to attend to present needs and then also anticipate future outcomes. And so I think that there's been a lot of really interesting work just sort of emerging, I've seen in Crip theory and disability rights, attending to ecology in a really serious way. Alison Kafer's queer feminist Crip seems like a really interesting sort of foray to that end, and I'm really hoping to see more.
It's a really good question. I'm processing it in many ways. One of the things that I think is interesting about emergent forms of eco-criticism is the way that they mobilize intersectional identity politics in order to mobilize groups of people that ordinarily really might not have an activist coalition. And I think that some of the more progressive modes of disability work is doing something similar to try to broaden the terminology, the way in which any person or sets of bodies could be potentially abled or disabled depending on context, situation, age, all sorts of other factors. So it seems to me that I understand what you're asking, I think, which is that how do you not essentialize the idea of a disability that's actually is real in some sense, that is grounded in the physical body, or when it comes to environmental concerns, without kind of, when you're at the same time you're trying to decentralize and expand. So I think in some ways it's better to just sort of not address that and address on the tactical effects that you can, if you can build different kinds of interactional or intersectional coalitions, that environmentalism then might fit more seamlessly into these kinds of things you're mentioning, rather than feeling you have to wrestle yourself out of this bind, if you know what I mean.
It's a great question. And I think there's actually more to like what the environment is in disability studies maybe than just that particular strain of the way that eco-criticism and disability come into tension. And that's because the environment is like the master trope of the social model of disability, that we can alter the environment instead of people. But what we should also say, Biela Coleman asked that question, and she's on a keynote panel about pathology and technology later. So like we have like a nice little echo chamber. We should all go to that panel. And Biela is the first person to introduce me to disability studies, so I like owe her an enormous amount. Anyway, but I think this is actually kind of like the beating heart of like disability studies right now, which is that the social model, if you take like a hardline social tack, does not allow for us to like make on the ground kind of investments in the ways that the second part of your question kind of suggested, like how do we fight poisoning, so just to say, I guess that like there's a kind of in the field, I think, of disability studies, and Alison Kafer's book is really at the fore of this. Also, Mel Chen's Animacies is an incredible treatment of this. Question is like, how do we reconcile some of the best things of the social model while returning to a kind of medical model that will allow a more emancipatory like agenda?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. We ask autistic people their perceptions of the causes of autism, and one of the key ways that they differ from modern research is they often always view it as a genetic cause and less as environmental, even though there's more and more emerging research linking autism to pesticides, to stresses during pregnancy, to various toxins. And I think it's because of that, this viewpoint that you can't, they don't want autism to be something that happened accidentally. A lot of times they want to view it as something that was selected for, like a view of evolution where things are selected for. But I think that diversity can be valuable regardless of its cause. So I think that the environmental factors are an important contributing factor to autism, but that, and that we should prevent against things that are harming the body, while still there's aspects of autism that are very valuable that have other causes.
I wanted to ask a question myself. This is not theory-based or anything, but I think it was interesting, Kristen, in your presentation you said one of the findings was they didn't find, people with autism didn't find it beneficial to hide online. And one of the things that I always kind of have been interested in is when people, especially online, if you have a disability, when you come out with your disability. I'm 32, and I always kind of tell people I didn't really come out with my disability until I was 25, 26. I didn't really own it. So what I'm kind of interested in is, could you expand on that more and why they felt they didn't need to hide online? Because I always felt that I needed to hide for the longest time.
So it's kind of an issue of how I worded it. So those were differences between autistic and non-autistic people. So they didn't differ from all of us in the degree to which they enjoyed the opportunity to hide online. But we do hide things online as well. And there's a lot of variability in those answers. So some autistic people do value the opportunity to seem more normal online. And they won't tell people that they're autistic there as well, also for privacy issues and things like that. While others will use it as a forum to come out and disclose. And others will feel it out. Like they'll start to engage with these communities without necessarily disclosing, and then feel out what the consequences might be. And disclosure is really a huge issue in autism. There's a lot of students in our mentorship program who leave behind their identification as autistic in high school. So the numbers are possibly as high in the general population as around 35% of students who were identified as autistic in high school don't tell their colleges, even though they could get needed support. And then disclosure has different effects on some people. So some people find it freeing and wonderful, and others encounter stigma. So there's definitely autistic people, I think, who are hiding online. They're just not doing it more than anyone else.
And I think we have time for one more question, if anybody wants to. If not, then I think we can end this here. Thank you so much. This was awesome. And again, thank you for letting me preside over this. Thank you all, and have a good I'm DJing the after party, so please come, because it's going to be a lot of ravers, dancing, those punk stuff, synth stuff, so please come. Have a great conference, everybody. Thank you.
That was great.
Thank you.
Yeah, we all liked it really well.
Yeah, that was, yeah.
I'm so glad you did those things. I was sort of frantically giving myself a crash course on how to review literature in psychology.